Morning. So this is page 31, Dry Rations, part 3. When the four of us reached the mountain spring, Discania, we were so happy we virtually stopped talking to each other. We feared that our trip here was someone's joke or mistake, and that we would be returned to plod through the icy waters at the gold mine's stone face. Our feet had been frostbitten a number of times, and our regulation issue galoshes couldn't protect them from the cold. We followed the tractor prints as if we were hunting some enormous prehistoric beast. But the tractor road came to an end, and we continued along an old, barely distinguishable footpath. We reached a small log cabin with 2 windows and a door hanging on a hinge that was cut from an automobile tire and nailed to the doorway. The small door had an enormous handle that looked like the handles on restaurant doors in big towns. Inside were cots made of slender logs. On the earthen floor lay a smoky black tin can. All around the small moss-covered cabin lay other rusty yellow cans of the same sort. The hut belonged to the geological prospecting group. More than a year had passed since anyone had lived in it. We were to live here and cut a road through the forest. We had brought saws and axes with us. It was the first time we had received our food ration in advance. I was carrying a small, cherished bag containing grain. Sugar, fish, and some lard. The bag was tied in several places with bits of twine like a sausage. Savelia had a similar sack, but Ivan Ivanovich had 2 of them sewn with large masculine stitches. The fourth, Fedya Shapov, had poured his grain frivolously into the pockets of his jacket and used a knotted foot rag that served us instead of socks to hold his sugar. He'd ripped out the inner pocket of the pea jacket for a tobacco pouch in which he carefully stored any cigarette butts he happened to come across. The very thought that this tiny 10-day ration had to be divided into 30 parts was frightening. Of course, we had the choice of eating twice a day instead of 3 times. We'd taken bread for only 2 days, since foreman would be bringing it to us. Even such a small group was unthinkable without a foreman. We were totally unconcerned with who he might be. We'd been told that we had to prepare our quarters before he arrived. We were all tired of barracks food. Each time they brought us in the soup in large zinc tubs suspended on poles, it made us all want to cry. We were ready to cry for fear that the soup would be thin, and when a miracle occurred and the soup was thick, we couldn't believe it and ate it as slowly as possible. But even with thick soup in a warm stomach, there remained a sucking pain. We'd been hungry for too long. All human emotions, love, friendship, envy, concern for one's fellow man, compassion, longing for fame, honesty, had left us with the flesh that had melted from our bodies during their long fasts. Savelyev and I decided to eat separately. The preparation of food is a special joy for a convict. To prepare food with one's own hands and then eat it was an incomparable pleasure, even if the skilled hands of a cook might have done it better. Our culinary skills were insignificant, and we didn't know how to prepare even a simple soup or kasha. Nevertheless, Svelyev and I gathered up the cans, washed them, burned them on the campfire, cooked, fussed, and learned from each other. Ivanovich and Fedya combined their food. Fedya emptied his pockets carefully, examining each stitch, cleaning out the individual grains with a grimy, broken fingernail. We, the four of us, were quite prepared for a trip into the future, either into the sky or into the earth. We were all well aware of the nature of scientifically determined food rations, of how certain types of food were brought in to replace others, and how a bucket of water was considered the equivalent in calories of a quarter pound of butter. We'd all learned meekness and had forgotten how to be surprised. We had no pride, vanity, or ambition, and jealousy and passion seemed as alien to us as Mars, and trivial in addition. It's much more important to learn to button your pants in the frost. Grown men cried they weren't able to do that. We understood that death was no worse than life, and we feared neither. We were overwhelmed by indifference. We knew that it was in our power to end this life the very next day, and now and again we made that decision, but each time life's trivia would interfere with our plans. Today they would promise an extra kilo of bread as a reward for good work, and it would be simply foolish to commit suicide on such a day. The following time, the orderly of the next barracks would promise us a smoke to pay back an old debt. We realized that life, even the worst life, consists of an alternation of joys and sorrows, successes and failures, and there was no need to fear the failures more than the successes. We were disciplined and obedient to our superiors. We understood that truth and falsehood were sisters, and that there were thousands of truths in the world, and that there were thousands of truths in the world. We considered ourselves virtual saints, since we had redeemed all our sins. By our years in camp. We had learned to understand people, to foresee their actions and fathom them. We had learned, and this was the most important thing, that our knowledge of people did not provide us with anything useful in life. What did it matter if I understood, felt, foresaw the actions of another person? I was powerless to change my own attitude toward him, and I couldn't denounce a fellow convict, no matter what he did. I refused to seek the job of foreman, which provided a chance to remain alive, for the worst thing in a camp was the forcing of one's own or anyone else's will on another person who was a convict just like oneself. I refused to seek useful acquaintanceships, to give bribes. And what good did it do to know that Ivanov was a scoundrel, that Petrov was a spy, or that Zaslavsky had given false testimony? Our inability to use certain types of weapons weakened us in comparison with certain of our neighbors who shared berths with us. We learned to be satisfied with the little things and rejoice at small successes. We learned one other amazing thing. In the eyes of the state and its representatives, a physically strong person was better, yes, better, more moral, more valuable than a weak person who couldn't shovel 20 cubic meters of dirt out of a trench in a day. The former was more moral than the latter. He fulfilled his quota, that is, carried out his chief duty to the state and society, and was therefore respected by all. The state and society was therefore respected by all. His advice was asked and his desires were taken into consideration. He was invited to meetings whose topic were far removed from shoveling heavy, slippery dirt from wet and slimy ditches. Thanks to his physical advantages, such a person was transformed into a moral force in the resolution of the numerous everyday questions of camp life. Of course, he remained a moral force only as long as he remained a physical force. When Ivan Ivanovich was brought to camp, he was an excellent worker. Now that he had become weak from hunger, he was unable to understand why everyone beat him in passing. He wasn't beaten severely, but he was beaten by the orderly, the barber, the contractor, the group leader, the work gang leader, the guard. Aside from these camp officials, he was also beaten by camp criminals. Ivan Ivanovich was happy that he had been included in our group. Fedya Shapov, a teenager from the Altai region, became physically exhausted before the others did, because his half-grown body was still not very strong. He was the only son of a widow, and he was convicted of illegal livestock slaughter. He had slaughtered a sheep, an act punishable by a 10-year sentence. Accustomed as he was to farm work, he found the frantic labor of the camp particularly difficult. Fedya admired the free life of the criminal element in camp, but there was something in his nature that kept him from becoming close to the thieves. His healthy peasant upbringing and love, rather than revulsion, for work helped him a little. The youngest among us, he immediately became attached to our oldest and most decent member, Ivan Ivanovich. Savelyev had been a student at the Moscow Telegraph Institute, and later was my fellow inmate in Butyrsk prison. As a loyal member of the Young Communist League, he was shaken by all he had seen, and he had written a letter to the party leader, since he was convinced that someone must be keeping such information from the leader. His own case was so trivial, writing letters to his fiancée, that the only proof of agitation, Article 58.10, consisted of their correspondence. His organization, point 11 of the same article, consisted of 2 persons. All this was noted down in dead seriousness on the interrogation form. Nevertheless, even in view of the then prevalent scale of offenses, no one believed he would be condemned to anything more than exile. Soon after sending the letter, on one of the days officially designated for petitions, Savelyev was called into the corridor and given a notice to sign. The Supreme Prosecutor informed him that he would personally examine his case. After that, Savelyev was summoned on only one other occasion to be handed the sentence of the special counsel, 10 years in the camps. In camp, Savelyev was rapidly reduced to a shade of his former self. But even then he could not comprehend the sinister punishment meted out to him. The 2 of us couldn't have been called friends. We simply loved to remember Moscow together. Her streets and monuments, the Moscow River, with its thin layer of oil that glistened like mother of pearl. Neither Leningrad nor Kiev nor Odessa could boast of such passionate devotees. The 2 of us could talk endlessly of Moscow. We set up the iron stove that we had brought with us in the cabin, and although it was summer, lit a fire. Warm, dry air was wonderfully aromatic. We were all accustomed to breathing the sour smells of old clothing and sweat. It was a good thing that tears have no odor. On the advice of Ivan Ivanovitch, we took off our underwear and buried it in the ground overnight. Each undershirt and pair of shorts was buried separately, with only small pieces protruding above the ground. This was a folk remedy against lice. Back at the mine, we had been helpless against them. In the morning, we discovered the lice really had gathered on the protruding bits of shirt. Although the land here lay under the permafrost, it nevertheless thawed sufficiently in summer for us to bury the articles of underwear. Of course, the soil in this area contained more stones than dirt, but even from this soil and ice, a stone there grew up dense pine forests with tree trunks so wide that it took 3 men with outstretched arms to span them. Such was the life force of the trees, a magnificent lesson given to us by nature. We burned the lice, holding the shirts up to the burning logs of the fire. Unfortunately, this clever method did not destroy the parasites, and on the very same day we boiled our underwear furiously, large tin cans. This time, the method of disinfection was a reliable one. It was later, in hunting mice, crows, seagulls, and squirrels, that we learned the magic qualities of the earth. The flesh of any animal loses its particular odor if it is first buried in the ground. Excuse me a moment. Excuse me. Thank you. We took every precaution to keep our fire from going out, since we only had a few matches that were kept by Ivan Ivanovitch. He wrapped the precious matches in a piece of canvas, and then in rags as carefully as possible. Each evening, we would lay 2 logs on the fire, and they would smolder till morning without either flaming up or going out. 3 logs would have burned up. Svaliev and I had learned the truth at our school desks, but Ivan Ivanovitch and Fedya had learned it as children at home. In the morning we would separate the logs. They would flare up with a yellow flame, and we would throw a heavy log on top. I divided the grain into 10 parts, but that was too alarming an operation. It was probably easier to feed 10,000 people with 5 loaves than for a convict to divide his 10-day ration into 30 parts. Ration cards were always based on a 10-day period. The 10-day system had long since died out on the mainland, but here it was maintained on a permanent basis. No one here saw any need for Sunday holidays or for the convicts to have rest days. Unable to bear this torment, I mixed all the grain together and asked Ivan Ivanovitch and Fedya to let me come in with them. I turned all my food into the common pot, and Svaliev followed my example. The flour of us made a wise decision to cook just twice a day. The 4 of us made a wise decision to cook just twice a day. There simply weren't enough provisions for 3 meals. We'll gather fruits and mushrooms, said Ivan Ivanovitch. We can catch mice and birds, and 1 or 2 days in the evening, 1 or 2 days in every 10 we can live on bread alone. But if we're to go hungry for 1 or 2 days every time we expect a food delivery, said Svaliev, then how will we be able to resist overeating when the stuff is actually brought? We decided to make the food as watery as possible and to eat only twice a day, no matter what. After all, No one would steal from us. We had all received our supplies intact, and we had no drunken cooks, thieving quartermasters, greedy overseers, criminals to take the best pieces, or any of that endless horde of administrators who without fear or any trace of control or conscience were able to pick the convict clean. Excuse me a moment. I'm just going to... Sorry. My apartment is mowing the lawn, apparently. Okay. We had received all our fats in the form of a lump of watery fat, some sugar, less than the amount of gold that I was able to pan, and sticky bread created by inimitable experts of the heavy thumb who fed the administrators of the bakery. There were 20 different kinds of grain that we had never heard of in the entire course of our lives, and it was all too mysterious and frightening. The fish that was to take the place of meat according to the replacement tables was half-spoiled herring, intended to replenish our intensified expenditure of protein. Alas, even the full ration we had received could not feed us or fill our belly. We required 3 times, 4 times as much, for our bodies had gone hungry for too long. We did not understand the simple truth. We believed in the norms, and we had never heard of the well-known remark made by all cooks that it is easier to cook for 20 persons than for 4. We understood one thing clearly, that we would not have enough food. This did not so much frighten as surprise us. We had to begin work and start cutting a road through the undergrowth of fallen trees. Trees in the north lying down like people, their enormous bared roots look like the claws of a monstrous predatory bird that had seized onto a rock. Downward from these gigantic claws to the permafrost stretched thousands of tiny tentacles, whitish shoots covered with warm brown bark. Each summer the permafrost retreats a little, and each inch of thawed soil is immediately pierced by a root shoot that digs in with its fine tendrils. The first reach maturity in 300 years, slowly hoisting their heavy, powerful bodies on these weak roots scattered flat over the stony soil. A strong wind easily topples these trees that stand on such frail feet. Trees fall on their backs, their heads pointed away from their feet, and die lying on a sofa. Thick layer of moss that is either bright green or crimson. Only the shorter twisted trees, tormented from following a constantly shifting sun and warmth, manage to stand firm and distant from each other. They have kept up such an intense struggle for existence for so long that their tortured, gnarled wood is worthless. The short, knotty trunk, entwined with terrible growths like splints of broken bones on broken bones, could not be used for construction even in the north, which was not fussy about materials. These twisted trees could not be used even as firewood, so well did they resist the axe. They would have exhausted any worker. Thus did they take vengeance on their broken northern lives. Thus did they take vengeance for their broken northern lives. Our task was to clear a road, and we boldly set out our work. set about our work. We sawed from sunrise to sundown, felled and stacked trees, wanting to stay here as long as possible and fearing the gold mine. We forgot about everything. The stacks grew slowly, and by the end of the second difficult day, it became evident that we had accomplished little, but were incapable of doing more. Ivan Ivanovich measured the distance from the tip of his thumb to the tip of his middle finger 5 times along a 10-year-old pine to make a 1-meter measuring stick. In the evening, the foreman came to measure our work with his notched staff and shook his head. We had accomplished 10% of the norm. Ivan Ivanovich tried to make his point and justify our measurements, but the foreman was unyielding. He muttered something about cubic meters and density, and although we were not familiar with the technical methods of measuring wood production, one thing was clear. We would be returned to the camp zone, where we would again pass through the gates with their inscription, "Work is honorable, glorious, valiant, heroic." In the camp we learned to hate physical labor and work in general, but we were not afraid. More than that, the foreman's assessment of our work and physical capacity as hopeless and worthless brought us a feeling of unheard of relief, and was not at all frightening. We realized we were at the end of our rope, and we simply let matters take their course. Nothing bothered us anymore, and we breathed freely in the fist of another man's will. We didn't even concern ourselves with staying alive, and ate and slept on the same schedule as in camp. Our spiritual calm, achieved by a dulling of the senses, was reminiscent of the dangerous, supreme freedom, of the dungeon's supreme freedom, and Tolstoy's non-resistance to evil. Our spiritual calm was always guarded by our subordination to another's will. We had long since given up planning our lives more than a day in advance. The foreman left, and we remained to cut a road through the forest and erect new log stacks, but now we did so with greater peace of mind and indifference. We stopped quarreling over who would take the heavy end when we stacked logs. We rested more and paid more attention to the sun, the forest, and the pale blue tall sky. We loafed. In the morning, Svelya and I felled an enormous black pine that had miraculously survived both storm and forest fire. We tossed the saw into the grass. It rang out, striking a stone, and we sat down on the trunk of the fallen tree. "Just imagine," said Svelya, "we'll survive, leave for the mainland, and quickly become sick old men. We'll have heart pains and rheumatism, and all the sleepless nights, the hunger, the long, hard work of our youth will leave their mark on us, even if we remain alive. We'll be sick without knowing why, groan and drag ourselves from one dispensary to another. This unbearable work will leave us with wounds that can't be healed, and all our later years will lead to lives of physical and psychological pain, and that pain will be endless and assume many different forms. But even among those terrible future days, there will be good ones, and we'll be almost healthy, and we won't think about our sufferings. And the number of those days will be exactly equal to the number of days each of us has been able to loaf in camp." "But how about honest work?" I asked. "The only ones who call for honest work are the bastards who beat and maim us, eat our food, and force us living skeletons to work to our very death. It's profitable for them, but they believe in honest work even less than we do." In the evening, we sat around our precious stove, and Fedya Shapov listened attentively to Savelyev's hoarse voice. Well, he refused to work. They made up a report, and he was dressed appropriately for the season. What does that mean, appropriately for the season? asked Fedya. Well, they can't list every piece of summer or winter clothing you have on. If it's in the winter, they can't write that you were sent to work without a coat or mittens. How often did you stay in camp because there were no mittens? Never, Fedya said timidly. The boss made us stamp down the snow on the road, or else they would have had to write that we stayed behind because we didn't have anything to wear. There you have it. Okay, tell me about the subway. And Savelyev would tell Fedya about the Moscow subway. Ivan Ivanovich and I also liked to listen to Savelyev, since he knew things that I had never guessed, although I had lived in Moscow. Muslims, Fedya said to Savelyev, delighted that he could still think clearly, are called to worship by a muezzin from the minaret. Muhammad chose the human voice as a signal to prayer. Muhammad tried everything: trumpets, tambourines, signal fires. Nothing pleased him. 1,500 years later, when they were choosing a signal to start the subway trains, it turned out that neither the whistle nor the horn nor the siren could be heard as easily by the train engineer's ear with the same precision as the live voices of the dispatcher on duty shouting, "Ready?" Fedya gasped with delight. He was better adapted than any of us to the forest, more experienced than any of us. In spite of his youth, Fedya could do carpentry work, build a simple cabin in the taiga, fell a tree and use its branches to make a shelter. In addition, Fedya was a hunter. In his locality, people were used to guns from childhood, but cold and hunger wiped out Fedya's qualities, and the earth ignored his knowledge and abilities. Fedya did not envy city dwellers, but simply acknowledged their superiority and could listen endlessly to their stories of the wonders of science and miracles of the city. Friendship is not born in conditions of need and trouble. Literary fairy tales tell of difficult conditions which are an essential element in forming any friendship, but such conditions are simply not difficult enough. If tragedy and need brought people together and gave birth to their friendship, then the need was not extreme and the tragedy was not great. Tragedy is not deep and sharp if it can be shared with friends. Only real need can determine one's spiritual and physical strength and set the limits of one's physical endurance and moral courage. We all understood that we could only survive through luck. Strangely enough, in my youth, whenever I experienced failure, I used to repeat the saying, "Well, at least we won't die from hunger." It never crossed my mind to doubt the truth of this sentence, and at the age of 30, I found myself in a very real sense dying from hunger and literally fighting for a piece of bread, and this was a long time before the war. When the four of us gathered at the spring Duskanya, we all knew that we had not gathered through friendship. We all knew that if we had survived, we would not want to meet again. It would be too painful to remember the insane hunger, the unchecked gastronomic lies at the fire, our quarrels with each other and our identical dreams. All of us had the same dreams of loaves of rye bread that flew past us like meteors or angels. A human being survives by his ability to forget. Memory is always ready to blot out the bad and retain only the good. There was nothing good at the spring Tuskanya, and nothing good was either expected in the future or remembered in the past by any of us. We had all been permanently poisoned by the North, and we knew it. 3 of us stopped resisting fate, and only Ivan Ivanovich kept working with the same tragic diligence as before. Savelyev tried to reason with Ivan Ivanovich during one of the smoking breaks. For us, it was just an ordinary rest period for non-smokers since we hadn't had any homemade tobacco for a number of years, and dry blackcurrant leaves, and there were heated convict discussions as to whether cowberry leaves or currant leaves were better. Experts maintained that both were worthless, since the body demands the poison of nicotine, not smoke. The brain cells could not be tricked by such a simple method, but currant leaves served for our smoking break. Since in camp the words rest from work presented too glaring a contradiction with the basic principles of production ethics held in far north. To rest every hour was both a challenge and a crime, and dried currant leaf was a natural camouflage. Listen, Ivan, Savelyev said, I'll tell you a story. In Van Lake we were working on the side track and hauling sand in our wheelbarrows. It was a long distance, and we had put out 25 meters per day. And we had put out 25 meters a day. If you didn't fill your quota, your bread ration got cut to 300 grams. Soup once a day. Whoever filled the quota got an extra kilo of bread and could buy a second kilo in the store if he had the cash. We worked in pairs, but the quotas were impossible. So here's what we did. One day we'd work for you from your trench and fill the quota. We'd get 2 kilos of bread plus your 300 grams, so we'd each get a kilo, 150 grams. So the next day we'd work for my quota, then for yours. We did it for a month, and it wasn't a bad life. Luckily for us, the foreman was a decent sort, since he knew what was up. It worked out well, even for him. His men kept up their strength and production didn't drop. Then some higher-ups figured things out, and our luck came to an end. How about trying it here, said Ivan Ivanovich. I don't want to, but we'll help you out. How about you? We couldn't care less, friend. I guess I don't care either. Let's just wait for the foreman to come. The foreman arrived in a few days, and our worst fears were realized. Okay, you've had your rest. Your time is up. Might as well give someone else a chance. This has been a bit like a sanatorium or maybe a health club for you, the foreman joked without cracking a smile. I guess so, said Savelyev. First you go to the club, and then off to play. Tie a tape to your toe and jump into your grave. We pretended to laugh out of politeness. When do we go back? Tomorrow. Ivan Ivanovich didn't ask any more questions. He hanged himself that night 10 paces from the cabin in the tree fork without even using a rope. I'd never seen that kind of suicide before. Savelyev found him, saw him from the path, and let out a yell. The foreman came running, ordered us not to take him down until the investigating group arrived, and hurried us off. Fedya, Shalamov, and I didn't know what to do. Ivan Ivanovich had some good foot rags that weren't torn. He also had some sacks, a calico shirt that he boiled to remove the lice, and some patched felt boots. His padded jacket lay on his bunk. We talked it over briefly and took the things for ourselves. Savelyev didn't take part in the division of the dead man's clothing. He just kept walking around Ivan Ivanovich's body. In the world of free men, a body always and everywhere stimulates a vague interest, attracts like a magnet. This is not the case either in war or in the camps, where the everyday nature of death and the deadening of feeling kills any interest in a dead body. But Savelyev was struck by Ivan Ivanovich's death. It had stirred up and lit some dark corners of his soul and forced him to make decisions of his own. He walked into the cabin, took an axe from one corner, and stepped back over the threshold. The foreman, who had been sitting on a mound of earth piled around the cabin, jumped up and began to shout something. Fedya and I ran out into the yard. Savelyev walked up to the thick, short pine log on which he had always sawed wood. The surface was scarred by the axe. The bark had all been chopped off. He put his left hand on the log, spread the fingers, and swung the axe. The foreman squealed shrilly. Fedya ran toward Savelyev, but the forefingers had already flown into the sawdust. At first we couldn't even see them among the branches and fine chips. Crimson blood surged from the stump of Savelyev's hand. Fedya and I ripped up Ivan Ivanovitch's shirt, applied the tourniquet, and bound the wound. The foreman took us back to camp. Savelyev was sent to the first aid point and from there to investigations to be tried on a charge of self-mutilation. Fedya and I returned to that same tent which we had left 2 weeks before with such hopes and expectations of happiness. The upper berths were already occupied by others, but we didn't care since it was summer, and even better to be lower down. There would be a lot of changes by winter. I fell asleep quickly, but woke up in the middle of the night. I walked up to the table of the orderly on duty, where Fedya was sitting with a sheet of paper in his hand. Over his shoulder I could read, "Mama." Fedya wrote, "Mama, I'm all right. Mama, I'm dressed appropriately for the season." The Injector, to Comrade A.S. Kolyma, Director of Mines, report. In response to your order requesting an explanation of the 6-hour period on the 12th hour of November of the current year during which the convicts work gang number 4 under my supervision in the Golden Spring mine stood idle, I report the following. The air temperature in the morning was 60 degrees below zero. Our thermometer was broken by the on-duty overseer, as I reported to you earlier. Nevertheless, it was possible to determine the temperature, since spit froze in midair. Work gang was brought to the site on time, but could not commence work, since the boiler injector serving our area and intended to thaw the frozen ground wouldn't work. I have already repeatedly brought the injector to the attention of the chief engineer. Nevertheless, no measures were taken, and the injector has now completely gone to pot. The chief engineer refuses to replace the injector just now. We have no place to warm up, and they won't let us make a fire. Furthermore, the guards won't permit the work gang to be sent back to the barracks. I've written everywhere I could, but I can't work with this injector any longer. The injector hardly works at all, and the plan for our area can't be fulfilled. We can't get anything done, but the chief engineer doesn't pay attention and just demands 6 cubic meters of soil. Mine engineer L.V. Kudinov, area chief of the Golden Spring mine. The following was written in neat longhand obliquely across the first report. 1. For refusing to work for 5 days and thus interfering with the production schedule, convict injector is to be placed under arrest for 3 days without permission to return to work and is to be transferred to a work gang with a penal regimen. 2. I officially reprimand Chief Engineer Goryev for lack of discipline in the production area. I suggest a convict injector be replaced with a civilian employee. Alexander Kolyma, Director of Mines. Thank you so much for listening. Tomorrow, the Apostle Paul. Have a great day. Take care.